By the spring of 1916, the Russian Empire appeared exhausted. 2 years of war had inflicted enormous losses on the Russian army. Millions had been killed, wounded, captured, or displaced. In 1915, a series of defeats had forced Russian forces into a massive retreat across Eastern Europe. Large territories had been lost. Confidence among both soldiers and civilians had been shaken. Many observers believed Russia's ability to continue offensive operations was rapidly declining. Yet in the summer of 1916, a Russian general named Aleksei Brusilov would launch an operation that surprised friend and foe alike. The offensive would become one of the most successful campaigns of the entire war, and one of the most consequential. The strategic situation in 1916 was complicated. On the Western Front, France was fighting desperately at Verdun. Britain was preparing for what would become the Battle of the Somme. The Allies wanted coordinated offensives that would force the Central Powers to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. Russian commanders were therefore encouraged to launch attacks in the east. Many senior officers remained skeptical. Previous offensives had often resulted in enormous casualties with limited gains. But Brusilov believed that failure was not inevitable. He argued that new methods could overcome many of the problems that had plagued earlier operations. His ideas challenged conventional thinking, and soon they would be put to the test. At the time, most offensives followed a predictable pattern. Large concentrations of troops assembled behind the front. Massive artillery bombardments announced where attacks would occur. Defenders often had days to prepare. Brusilov proposed something different. Instead of focusing on a narrow sector, he planned simultaneous attacks across a broad front. Special assault units would move into concealed forward positions. Artillery preparation would be shorter and more precise. The objective was surprise. If successful, enemy commanders would struggle to identify the main point of attack and would find it difficult to move reserve effectively. The approach was innovative, and it would soon demonstrate remarkable results. The offensive began on June 4th, 1916. Across hundreds of kilometers of front line, Russian artillery suddenly opened fire. Unlike previous bombardments, this one was carefully targeted. Enemy's strong points, trenches, communication routes, and artillery positions were identified in advance. The goal was not simply destruction, it was disruption. When the shelling ended, Russian assault units advanced rapidly. Many Austro-Hungarian defenders were caught off guard. In several sectors, frontline positions fell within hours. The surprise was almost complete. For the first time in many months, Russian forces achieved breakthroughs on a scale few believed possible. The Austro-Hungarian Army faced a crisis. Entire defensive sectors began collapsing. Units became isolated. Communications broke down. Thousands of soldiers surrendered. Others attempted chaotic retreats under heavy pressure. Russian forces captured large numbers of prisoners, artillery pieces, and supplies. Military leaders in Vienna were alarmed. Reports arriving from the front painted a picture of disaster. The offensive threatened not merely local positions, but the stability of entire armies. Within weeks, some Austro-Hungarian formations had suffered losses on a scale rarely seen during the war. The success of the offensive forced Germany to react. German commanders recognized that Austria-Hungary could not contain the attack alone. Reinforcements were rushed eastward. Divisions that might otherwise have been used against France or Britain were redirected to stabilize the front. This was precisely the kind of pressure the Allies had hoped to create. The Brusilov Offensive was no longer simply a Russian operation. It had become a major strategic event affecting the entire war. German troops began arriving in increasing numbers. Their presence slowed the Russian advance. But stopping the offensive completely would prove far more difficult. One of the most remarkable aspects of the campaign was the scale of the gains. Russian forces advanced into territories that had previously appeared secure. Important cities and strategic positions changed hands. Large areas of modern-day Ukraine became major battle zones. The offensive demonstrated that trench warfare was not always an impenetrable stalemate. Under the right conditions, defenses could be broken. Military observers across Europe studied the campaign carefully. Many saw Brusilov's methods as a glimpse into the future of offensive warfare. Some of his innovations would later influence military tactics far beyond the Eastern Front. The victories also produced significant political consequences. Watching events unfold, the Kingdom of Romania concluded that the Central Powers appeared vulnerable. Romanian leaders saw an opportunity to gain territory and influence the outcome of the war. In August 1916, Romania entered the conflict on the side of the Allies. At first, this appeared to be another success resulting from Brusilov's achievements. However, the situation would prove more complicated. Romania soon found itself facing powerful counterattacks. What initially seemed like a strategic opportunity would eventually become another difficult struggle. Nevertheless, the offensive had already altered the political landscape of Eastern Europe. Despite its success, the offensive carried enormous costs. Russian forces suffered heavy casualties as they continued advancing against determined resistance. Each breakthrough required fresh attacks. Each attack consumed manpower, ammunition, and supplies. The Russian army had achieved what many believed impossible, yet maintaining momentum proved increasingly difficult. Transportation networks struggled to keep pace with the advancing front. Replacements often lacked adequate training. Equipment shortages persisted. The deeper Russian forces advanced, the more difficult it became to sustain operations on such a vast scale. Victory itself was creating new challenges. Meanwhile, German reinforcements continued arriving. Experienced units strengthened weakened sectors and improved defensive coordination. The Central Powers adapted to the new reality. What had begun as a dramatic collapse gradually transformed into a more stable front. The pace of Russian advances slowed. Opportunities that had seemed limitless only weeks earlier became increasingly difficult to exploit. Brusilov repeatedly requested additional support from other Russian fronts. He hoped that coordinated attacks elsewhere might prevent the enemy from concentrating reserves against him. Unfortunately, those efforts failed to produce the level of cooperation he needed. The offensive remained impressive, but it was no longer unstoppable. By late summer and early autumn, the offensive was losing momentum. Russian forces still controlled significant gains. Large territories had been captured. The Austro-Hungarian Army had suffered one of the worst defeats in its history. Yet the decisive collapse many had hoped for never occurred. The Central Powers managed to stabilize the front before complete disaster unfolded. The opportunity to deliver a knockout blow gradually disappeared. Even so, the scale of the achievement remained extraordinary. Millions of soldiers had participated. Entire armies had been shattered. The military balance on the Eastern Front had been transformed. Historians often describe the Brusilov Offensive as the most successful Russian military operation of the First World War. Its tactical innovations influenced military thinking for years afterward. Many of the concepts employed by Brusilov anticipated methods later used during 20th century warfare. The offensive demonstrated the value of surprise, decentralized planning, precise artillery support, and simultaneous attacks across multiple sectors. Military academies would study these lessons long after the war ended. Ironically, however, battlefield success could not solve Russia's deeper problems. Political tensions continued growing. Economic difficulties intensified. Public confidence in the government remained fragile. The victories of 1916 could not reverse the forces that were already pushing the empire toward crisis. The human cost of the offensive was staggering. The Austro-Hungarian Army suffered catastrophic losses, including hundreds of thousands of prisoners captured during the campaign. Russian casualties were also immense. Entire communities across Eastern Europe felt the consequences. Families waited for news that often never arrived. Villages lost generations of young men. Across the vast battlefields of the Eastern Front, victory and tragedy existed side by side. The Brusilov Offensive demonstrated that even the most successful military operations could come at a terrible price. For the soldiers who fought in the campaign, the statistics recorded by historians represented real lives, real sacrifices, and real suffering. Less than a year after the offensive, Russia itself would enter a period of profound upheaval. In 1917, revolution swept through the empire. The Romanov dynasty fell. Political authority fractured. The Russian army increasingly struggled with discipline, morale, and organization. Many of the soldiers who had participated in Brusilov's victories would soon find themselves caught in an entirely different conflict, the Russian Civil War. Looking back, the offensive appears almost symbolic. It represented the final great triumph of Imperial Russia before the empire itself began to collapse. A remarkable military success achieved on the eve of national transformation. Today, the Brusilov Offensive remains one of the most studied campaigns of the First World War. Military historians continue examining its innovations, achievements, and limitations. It demonstrated how careful planning, surprise, and tactical flexibility could overcome even heavily fortified defensive systems. At the same time, it revealed the limits of military success when political and economic foundations are weakening. The campaign altered the course of the war on the Eastern Front. It nearly destroyed one of Europe's great armies, and it secured Aleksei Brusilov's place among the most influential commanders of the 20th century. More than 100 years later, the lessons of 1916 still resonate. The Brusilov Offensive was one of the greatest military achievements of World War I. It shattered Austro-Hungarian defenses, forced Germany to divert critical resources, encouraged Romania to enter the war, and introduced tactical innovations that would influence future generations of military planners. Yet its success could not save Imperial Russia. The empire's political and economic problems ran deeper than any battlefield victory could solve. In the end, the offensive stands as both a triumph and a warning, a demonstration of what military brilliance can accomplish, and a reminder of the limits of military power when nations themselves are under strain.